Welcome everyone to our data conference. I was just about to check with Victoria to see if we're ready to start, and it sounds like we are. So welcome everybody. If you haven't joined us before for a Waccamaw Data Conference, then this will be completely normal to you. But if you have joined us before, it's a little bit different. We went virtual this time just out of, sense of safety for everyone. So bear with us. It's our first virtual Waccamaw Data Conference, I believe. But we'll go ahead and get started. We have a couple great presentations for you today, and we're really looking forward to it. So thank you all for joining. Victoria, if you want to go on to the next slide, that'd be awesome. Okay. I know that probably everybody's been through a Zoom meeting before. We are doing things a little bit different with a Zoom webinar. So you'll notice that all of you participants are muted, and you don't see your beautiful faces staring back at you on the side of your screen. We miss seeing your faces too, but this will make it a little bit easier on everybody to kind of pay attention and stay focused. So you are currently muted, and if you have a question, there will be a Q&A session afterwards. So we'll get to how you can ask questions and mess with your viewing options to find what works best for you. And if you do have a question, you can click down at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. You can type in and submit your question. If it's something for the speaker to answer, we'll get to it. If it's something that we can easily answer, we might answer it for you. But we will answer your questions one way or another. We are recording the data conference and it will be shared, and Victoria and I will be sending out a feedback survey later in the week. So stay tuned for that information. So you can ask your questions through the Q&A function or through the chat. All right. If you have any questions about how to ask questions, put it in the chat and we'll try and help you. All right. On to the next one, Victoria. So our agenda is a little bit different this time, but we have two really great presentations for you. Dr. Susan Libes and Victoria Green will be presenting on our recent results from the Waccamaw River Volunteer Monitoring Program. Many of you in attendance are volunteers, so you'll get to see what your data looks like this year and what's going on with it. And then after that, we will have a presentation from Dr. Pamela Martin, and she's going to talk about the politics of rights of nature. She has a new book out, and it's a really interesting concept, and I hope that y'all will stick around and find out a little bit more about that. To those of you who are not volunteers, this is obviously open to the public, and we hope you get to learn a little bit about our volunteer monitoring program today. And yeah, and if you're interested in joining, we'll tell you how to do that at the end. We're also going to get some updates from our municipal partners, and we'll hear what they are using our data for. So let me just take a moment. I should have done this at the beginning. I want to introduce myself and also my colleague, Victoria Green. I'm Kara Schultneck. I am your Waccamaw River Keeper with Winyah Rivers Alliance, and I serve as the field leader for the Waccamaw Volunteer Monitoring Program, helping to coordinate volunteers from Lake Waccamaw in North Carolina all the way down to Winyah Bay in South Carolina. And I'm gonna let Victoria introduce herself. So Victoria, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Green. I'm the Volunteer Monitoring Program Manager for the Waccamaw Watershed Academy, and I help coordinate the program along with Kara and also our programs in Surfside Beach, Merle's Inlet, and Briarcliff Acres.
Thanks, Victoria. We also have our speaker, Susan, who we'll get her to introduce herself when we get to her presentation, and we'll give Chelsea a couple minutes here to introduce herself as well. If you're new to the program, our volunteer monitoring program is exactly what it says it is. It's a volunteer monitoring program along the Waccamaw River and in some of our swamps, and also in Lake Waccamaw, where volunteers monitor water quality twice a month. And they're collecting all kinds of good data. They're collecting dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity, nutrient data, also turbidity and bacteria data. So they are collecting all this great data, and then we bring it back, and the Volt, the team that Victoria, Susan, and Kelly and I make up, look at the data, make sure that everything's okay, and then we make it public online for everybody. And if you're interested in volunteering, if you're not one of our volunteers, please feel free to contact me or Victoria, and we will hopefully get you on a team and get you out there sampling. But we wouldn't be able to do this program without our supporters and our funders from our local municipalities. And we want to extend a huge thank you to all of those funders in both South Carolina and North Carolina. And these funders also get the data so that they can better serve our areas. And we work with our local stormwater managers. And here today to talk a little bit about what we do and what they do and how it all comes together is Chelsea Cogliano from Horry County Stormwater. So Chelsea, if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you so you can give a little update to the volunteers.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, perfect. So before I introduce myself, I just wanted to make note. I did not know y'all were called the Volts until the Christmas card came, and it was lovely. It was great. Like Kara said, I'm Chelsea Cogliano. I am the watershed planner for Horry County Stormwater. And I've been with the county for almost 3 years now, which is crazy to me because I feel like I just started here yesterday. I am always learning something new, and I hope that continues because it makes each day go by very easily. So I made a few notes that I wanted to touch on today, so don't mind if my eyes are kind of going all over the place here. I will say that one thing that I have learned a lot about is the importance of water quality and the collecting of the data that all of y'all do, and maybe that some of y'all will be doing in the future if you are new to volunteer monitoring. If it wasn't for you guys, we would not be able to fix some of the problems that come up, especially when the data comes in and we get alerts. The communication, I will say, has always been there since I've started, and I'm sure before that. When you guys collect data and you see something high priority and you get it in to Victoria, she's always contacting me from the spot, and we try to get on it as fast as we can. So I was thinking I always try to start my day with something positive and something that I'm going to try to achieve during the day. And this morning I woke up and I was thinking, okay, I have this data conference today. What am I going to say to all of you? And it dawned on me that water quality is not a straight line. You know, you might find a problem and you find the source of that problem, but then you have to monitor that problem. So that's why it's very important for us to be getting this data from everybody. You know, that's why we call it monitoring, because we're always trying to monitor the situation. So for example, I started thinking, I was like, let's take, for example, I hate to say it, I'm going to say it, the L word, landfill. Okay, so take the landfill into consideration. And, you know, there might be several issues that we have had there in the past, but say we get a turbidity hit and it's been a consecutive problem. We all partner together. We partner with Solid Waste Authority. We partner with the engineers on site, and we try to communicate. And that's like the biggest thing with water quality. I feel like there's so many partners in it. It starts with you, and then it comes to us, and we are the ones trying to figure out what can we do. So while, you know, the turbidity is still not A+ perfect in the situation, we still, I feel like we still, you know, got on top of it. We figured out what we needed to do, and we started implementing more measures that could help with turbidity and can help with issues that come from it. And then those further will, you know, improve the water quality in Sterrett Swamp and further that into the Waccamaw River. So while these issues, I won't say are success stories, there's something that's always going to be monitored, and that's why you will always be needed. And I feel like with y'all, we get closer and closer every day with trying to get to the root of some of these issues. I will say that, you know, all this is still a work in progress. I had a blast a couple months ago going out and meeting some of y'all. I met with, I think it was Team 2, and that was a blast. I met a group on Old Reefs Ferry Landing, and it was nice to put some faces to the names and actually be able to go out there and see the instruments that you're using and how you fill out the forms. And we put out a social media post on it just to try to get more people, you know, familiar with water quality. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to being able to come out there. I graduated from Coastal Carolina with a marine science degree, and I know how important it is to collect data and, you know, keep water quality a priority. And I know a lot of people that are new to water quality have some trouble putting it first. You know, there's a lot of new development going on in the county, and you know, people's first reaction is all these people are coming here. Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? And I think water quality is starting now to become a priority, and that's really special. So again, I want to say thank you to everybody for doing what you do. It does not go unnoticed. We use the data all the time, and when we get those provisional reports in, we are always monitoring the situation, whether that's, I will say sometimes it can be aggravating because you might feel like the process is slow, what's taking them so long, but water quality is always going to be something that takes time. So again, thank you. And if you have any questions or you want to reach out to me, Victoria or whoever will be happy to give you my email or my cell phone number. And like I said, thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. That was really, really nice. And you made a great point. It's not a straight line. And if anybody has questions for Chelsea, you can pop those in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll make sure that she gets them. And Chelsea, as you were speaking, funnily enough, I got a call from a reporter about the L word. So it's definitely in the news, and it's definitely something that, yeah, that we are monitoring. So your data goes a long way, y'all. Like it really informs things that are going on in the community. So thank you. So y'all will notice that we have a lot of different partners, but unfortunately, many of them weren't able to join us today. But Tracy Jones with Georgetown County wanted me to remind all the volunteers how important y'all are, and that that you're a part of the county stormwater program, and that you represent an extension of the staff for her and her staff. So, you know, I always tell y'all this, that as the river keeper, I couldn't do it all by myself. Chelsea can't do it all by herself. Tracy can't do it all by herself. We really need you. So thank you to each and every one of you for everything that you do. Okay, so with that, I think we can jump into our presentation on the recent trends or recent results and trends in volunteer monitoring. So we're going to pass it over to Susan, I believe. Right, Victoria? We covered everything else. Yes, there's a great comment in the chat. Our volunteers deserve a pay raise, y'all. So I think we should increase their pay by at least 100%. So, all right. I'm sure many of you know Dr. Susan Libes. She is a professor emeritus, is that the correct term, at Coastal Carolina? And distinguished professor emeritus. She is integral to this volunteer monitoring program. She might be retired, but she has not gone anywhere. So she's still doing a lot of work with us, and we're really grateful to have her here. And grateful that she was able to present to y'all today. So I'm going to pass it over to her, and enjoy, everybody.
Thank you, Kara. Can everybody hear me? Okay, and you can see my first slide?
We see it.
Wonderful. Okay, so by way of a little bit more introduction, I live on the Waccamaw River, a little bit north of the landfill, and I have been monitoring as a volunteer since the start of the program. I actually started a bit earlier than the program did, so I can't retire. I have to stay on as a volunteer, and of course I'm endlessly fascinated by the data and really value working with the municipalities to help protect water quality and make it better. For today, we've got a story for you about your 2021 data that will start off with a discussion about what the river has been up to in terms of water flow or hydrology, because that's such an important control on water quality. The big story that we have to tell you is about an algae bloom, I call it a super bloom, that started in May and ended up having us think about harmful algal blooms as an emerging concern now for the Waccamaw. Victoria is going to talk on that subject. And finally, if we have time left over, we do have slides prepared to discuss what Chelsea was talking about, and that's the great progress that has been made in dealing with, I'll call it an illicit discharge in Sterrett Swamp, but we'll have to see how we go with time here. So let me start off first by talking about what was going on with weather and climate in 2021, because it was lower than normal, and that kind of has a big impact on any kind of water quality story. So I also am volunteering in the NOAA COCORA's volunteer rain monitoring network. I'm site SCHR 61. I know a lot of the other volunteers are also doing rain observation. So we do look at all of your data, and it is displayed online with the water quality data. But this is just my data. I'm, again, 4 miles north of Conway on the east bank of the Waccamaw. So my 10-year average this year was the anniversary of my 10th year of rain observations, is shown with the green boxes. You can see that half of the months in 2021, we were below normal, particularly in April through May and then September onward. So you'll be hearing a lot about those months in the presentation today. The State Climatology Office that administers our local COCO-RAS program also contributes to the U.S. Drought Monitor, and the data that we've got for 2021 is shown up here, that there were periods of severe drought in 2021. It's been a long time since we've seen a severe drought. That I'll show that slide in just a minute. But again, due to lack of rainfall, we had drought conditions in May through July and October through present. So there was a little lag after the period of low rainfall before the drought started. All these data are online, by the way, and really interesting to watch. The drought record over the past decade is shown in this graph. So we were just looking. Hey, can everybody see my cursor moving around? Kara, can you see my cursor moving around?
Yes.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, thanks.
Very small though.
It's very small. Okay, so severe drought in 2021, and we hadn't seen a severe drought, that's that orangey color, since way back in 2012. Why is that? Because we've had year after year after year of significant hurricanes that brought significant rainfall, sort of in the second half, last quarter of the year. And I know everybody's got these names engraven on their brain. In 2020 in particular, we had a whole spate of nearby visits from hurricanes. Remember, that was the year we first ran out of names. We had 70 inches of rain, and that's way more than normal. Again, last year we had, let's see, 56 inches of rain, and normal is around 61. So we had 70 inches of rain. I bet Chelsea remembers that one. So now moving back over to 2021, we did have an active year in terms of named storm. This was the first time on record that 2 consecutive hurricane seasons exhausted the list of 21 storm names, but we had no impact in the coastal South Carolina area. And that's part of the reason that we had these severe drought conditions and very low flow. So what I'm going to show you next is the low river discharge in 2021, especially compared to 2020. So here's some data from the United States Geological Survey. This is from a sensor that is located near the Highway 9 volunteer monitoring site. There's a 70-year record here of what is normal. That's the green. We're showing river discharge in units of cubic feet per second on a logarithmic scale on the vertical axis. Anything in purple or blue is high. Anything in orange or this brownish red is abnormally low. So the observation in 2020 here is in the black line, and notice that most of it was sitting above the green, above normal. So we had 70 inches of rain here, whereas in 2021, we had April through July, very low flows here, below normal. At times we got almost to record lows. And then from September to present, we dip back down into abnormally low flows. When we have low flow, we end up with higher dissolved solids that you guys measure as conductivity. And the reason for that is that there's less dilution of groundwater from rainfall. You've got less rainfall, less dilution. Where do the dissolved solids come from? Mostly from groundwater seepage, which we have a lot of groundwater seepage around here because we have a pretty high water table on the land. Or if you're at some of the downstream sites, there's tidal flow that pushes water from Winyah Bay pretty far upstream, certainly to Hagley Landing. So the data that show this are in the graph here on this slide. Conductivity on the vertical axis, with the red showing what the median level is at all of the sites on the main stem of the river. All these different colors are the different sampling sites. So you can see this big bulge over here. That was drought time, May through July, and then September onward, where we were well above the median in just about every site, particularly in the downstream sites. The two most downstream, I have to show on a separate graph because the conductivities are so much higher. You're seeing the influence of the salt water as we get pretty close to Winyah Bay. That's at the Sandpit River site in black and Hagley Plantation in blue, Hagley Landing. And finally, the most downstream I can show you data on is from the North Inlet Winyah Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve sensors that are located in the bay itself. You can see from the start of the year into March, there was hardly any dissolved solids. Here we're measuring this as salinity rather than conductivity because the conductivity is like 52,000 when you pick up salinity this high. So I've switched over to salinity measurement. Again, April through July, we saw the impact of the drought all the way down in Winyah Bay, that the conductivities went up here and stayed up, got even higher as we moved from September onward. So I hope I've made the case that we saw a big water quality impact in terms of total dissolved solids as a consequence of the limited rainfall, drought conditions, and resulting low flow in the river. So given that background, the most notable event through the year that impacted just about every site that the volunteers sample was an algae superbloom that started in May. It was most intense from Winyah Bay upstream to Bucksport, and it was detected by the volunteer monitoring program, as well as Coastal Carolina University's river monitoring program that the certified lab runs. I'm also going to show you corroborating data from the United States Geological Survey's water quality sensors that are co-located at some, but not all, of the volunteer monitoring sites. And I already have shown you a little bit about the Winyah Bay sensors. So just to remind everybody where our sampling sites are located at, North Carolina are the most upstream sites. There are 4 sites in Lake Waccamaw, and then 2 sites north of the state boundary, Pireway and Babson's Landing. There's the Highway 9 site where one of the USGS sensors are located. And then here's me monitoring. Oh, this is Reeves Ferry and me monitoring at Murrell's Landing, Conway and Pitch Landing. And then these downstream sites, Bucksport, Waccamaw, Hagley, and Sandpit, I'll be speaking the most about today. So you can see Sandpit is sort of at the head of Winyah Bay. The National Estuarine Research Reserve sensors are all the way down here in the bay proper. So what are algal blooms and who cares? These are times when the abundance of single-celled photosynthetic, microscopic photosynthetic organisms get very, very large. So lots of cells. I've got a little picture here taken under a microscope of what some of these cells look like, nothing much, a bunch of little green circles. That green in there is from the pigment chlorophyll that enable these algae, like land plants, to do a metabolism called photosynthesis, where they use the sun's energy to make their own food. They take inorganic carbon out of the water and transform it into organic carbon. And in doing so, their waste product is oxygen gas, which is a good thing if you're a fish or any other kind of animal, but too much of these algae can be a problem. You may have noticed evidence of this in the form of green scum, certainly around some of the stormwater ponds around here. That scum can block light. And after the death of the algae or the consumers that eat the algae, the leftover organic matter decomposes and uses up oxygen, the oxygen that the algae produce. The oxygen gets used up in the decomposition, and that's a problem. It can cause fish kills and kills of other animals living in the water. Victoria is going to tell you about another problem with these algal blooms, and that is possibility that toxic algae may be present. Some species of algae, not all of them, and not every member of the species, can make toxins that can lead to fish kills or even negatively affect a pet dog that might be swimming in the water, or you might inhale the cells that get kicked up into the air if you're walking by or swimming in the water. So there's a lot of concern about these toxic algae. They can even be a problem in reservoirs and impact drinking water. So a lot of attention is currently being focused at developing monitoring programs for these toxic algae. Victoria is going to tell you some initiatives she's been involved in along these lines. We're particularly concerned about them because algal blooms seem to be a consequence of development of the land, where we're causing input of nitrogen and phosphorus and some trace metals that stimulate the growth of the algae. We also think that climate change may be accelerating blooms and causing a higher frequency of the toxic algal species. So a lot of attention now focused on developing monitoring programs that really follow up quite well with the monitoring you've been doing, because a lot of what we've targeted here in our volunteer monitoring program are measuring things that are really good at detecting algal blooms. That was part of the rationale behind why we chose what we did for you to measure. So I'm going to show you data that support the occurrence of that big bloom in May based on oxygen saturation, pH, turbidity, and your nutrients. The only thing I'm not going to be talking about that you measure is E. coli. When your meter reports to you an oxygen saturation level, I wanted to point out that the meter is using the temperature and conductivity and oxygen concentrations to transform it into a saturation level. So we truly are going to use all your data, but the E. coli today to make the story. Sometimes Victoria has been looking at grab samples that were collected during your sampling for screening for the harmful algal species. So she'll talk more about that later. The certified lab at Coastal Carolina University is measuring the same meter parameters as you guys, plus making chlorophyll measurements. The nutrients that they measure are a bit different, the total nitrogen and the total phosphorus. What you measure in the field is actually better for detecting phytoplankton blooms than measuring total nitrogen. But the only phosphorus data we've got is from the environmental quality lab. There just aren't good methods for volunteers to use to measure phosphorus. The USGS is measuring continuously with their sensors every 15 minutes as compared to twice a month for the other two monitoring programs. And we're offset here, so every week somebody's out there monitoring. The USGS has a limited number of sites and their sensors are positioned in the bottom water. So they help us compare our surface water samples. We can tell that algae have been active in the surface waters relative to the bottom. Their parameters are about the same as the volunteer monitoring. And ditto with the North Inlet Winyah Bay reserve sensors down in Winyah Bay. It's the same suite of meter measurements plus chlorophyll. They have sensors in the surface and the bottom waters. So onto your data. The first thing that we observed that really caught our attention was these very high oxygen saturations. Vertical axis here, oxygen saturation. Anything over 100 means there's an excess of oxygen present in the water that must have been put there by the algae that are producing oxygen faster than it is being removed, either by animals or by microbes decomposing organic matter. Some of these are record high numbers. So we saw these down at Bucksport, Waccamaw Landing, Hagley, and Enterprise. By way of contrast, the typical warm weather concentration that we'd expect to see in May is around 60%. And that's what we saw at the upstream sites. Reeves Ferry was all the way down to 40%. So that's more typical of summertime conditions. Just to give you an idea of how this compares to the rest of your data set, I am showing the box plot. And by the way, all the graphs I'm showing today were produced by the web app that's available online for everybody to use. The box shows 50% of the data, and the line in the middle of the box is the median level. So about 60% is an overall kind of median across all of the sampling sites. And what we measured on May 26th was very, very high, above the 90th percentile, which is the hinge up above the box. And these three values at Bucksport, Waccamaw, and Hagley were record highs for these sites, well above 100%. We also noticed that the pH was very high. By high, I mean that the values on May 26 were well above 7. Typically, what we see in your samples are levels way below 7. The Waccamaw rivers are acidic, falling below a pH of 7. But instead, what we saw, particularly on the downstream end, well, even here at the middle of the river, were values quite close to 7, and then downstream very high above 7 with a record high of 7.4 at Hagley. There are 2 reasons for this. One is related to the algae. When the single-celled organisms are conducting photosynthesis and removing carbon from the water, they're removing it in the form of CO2, which is a weak acid. So they're removing an acid, and that makes the pH go up to more alkaline or basic conditions. The second reason why the pHs were higher during this period was because of the drought. When conductivity is high, you have higher concentrations of total dissolved solids that include bicarbonate, and bicarbonate raises the pH. So 2 reasons for these high pHs. The EQL was out monitoring. They sampled a week earlier, well, 6 days earlier than us, and also noticed very high supersaturations of oxygen at the same 2 sites, Bucksport and Hagley. Again, they're grab sampling from the surface waters. So I think we corroborated that there was an algal bloom certainly present at Bucksport and Hagley. Notice they don't have as many sites as we do. So they didn't have Enterprise, and they didn't have Sandpit or Waccamaw. But they are measuring chlorophyll on the 20th of May when the high supersaturations were present. Oh my, the chlorophyll concentrations were very high. A 102 parts per billion, which is the same as a microgram per liter, and 128 parts per billion. And these got our attention. They're certainly suggestive that a harmful algal bloom might be present. What the typical chlorophyll concentrations are like is shown here in the box plot from the Environmental Quality Lab's monitoring program. They typically see around 1 part per billion. The EPA has recommended not going above 0.4. There are no water quality criteria in the state yet for chlorophyll, so we need to look at these data for guidance. These numbers of 102 and 128 are just very, very high, exceptionally high outliers, and further confirmation that we have what I'm calling is a super bloom of algae. The USGS sensors located at Hagley and Bucksport also showed very high oxygen concentrations. Now, the USGS, for some reason, does not show oxygen saturation. So I've got to show you the oxygen data, but trust me, this is super saturated. Saturated concentrations are probably around 6 parts per thousand. So these are very super saturated, and they're in that same time period of mid-May to early June that we were detecting with the volunteer monitoring program. Notice that Conway doesn't show that much of an effect. So it looks like the super bloom was limited down there to Bucksport and Hagley. What about down in Winyah Bay? They're measuring supersaturations down there in the surface and the bottom water, and both were supersaturated. Now, these are the highest supersaturations I've shown you today. On the 20th, 154%. What were the chlorophyll concentrations doing during that period? They also got very, very high. Remember, the median is down around 1. The highest value reported up here was 64 parts per billion. So again, this is why I'm calling this a super bloom. And it looked like this persisted from that same time period that we saw up at Bucksport and Hagley, from mid-May to the beginning of, well, in this case, end of May. I'm zooming in here on the data to show you daily cycles of oxygen saturation, the chlorophyll, and the pH. So the top panel is the oxygen saturation with the chlorophyll. So once a day, even though this site is tidal, you're seeing high levels of chlorophyll peaking at about midday. And then this is a 2-day period in here. And then the bottom panel is showing you the same story with pH. The pH peaks with oxygen saturation. So the photosynthesis is causing high chlorophyll, high algae pigment, producing a lot of oxygen and raising the pH, all in lockstep. It was surprising to me that we did not see something similar going on in Sandpit, given how close the sampling site, this is at East Bay Park, is to the sensors in Winyah Bay, but there was just no evidence of an algal bloom here at Sandpit. Now, you guys are also measuring nutrients with test strips, nitrate, nitrite, and ammonia. The ammonia in particular is the favored form of nitrogen that algae take up. And I'm showing you here a couple of years of data of your nutrient results at Bucksport, Waccamaw, and Hagley, where the oxygen saturations were high. And notice that we had quite the spate here of nitrate and ammonia detections. I just added them all together here to show you there were nitrogen nutrients here, not just during that drought in April and May, but sort of through the rest of the year. We had quite a few detections of nutrients. The algal bloom in May certainly coincided with that period of time when the conductivity was very high. I look at the conductivity data to tell me something about where the water is coming from, as well as the drought status. So high conductivity tells me there's a groundwater source, or tidal water is being brought upstream from Winyah Bay. So there's definitely a connection here between a period of high conductivity and the super bloom, but it's not clear why the coincidence is present. Similarly, we saw a coincidence of high turbidity at the downstream sites here. And some of the upstream sites. Pitch Landing, Peachtree, Enterprise, and Bucksport, we had a peak here of relatively high turbidity that coincided with the high conductivity period. Not two of these sites, Enterprise and Bucksport, where we saw the high oxygen saturation. So it is possible that having large numbers of algal cells in the water contributed to the turbidity, but doesn't explain why Pitch Landing and Peachtree also had this peak of high turbidity. I did want to point out the difference between the water being colored. We have a black water color to the Waccamaw River and the water being turbid. This is where you have particles that make the water opaque. So we can have both of these, color in the water and then particles on top of that, and you end up with this sort of murky look to the water as opposed to the clear transparent tint that we usually have. Now, there was definitely some kind of algal activity going on upstream of Hagley and Bucksport. I know that because I've got a pretty tight chlorophyll series at my volunteer monitoring site I call Merle's Landing. So this is 4 miles north of Conway. This little peak in here, I measure every other day. This little peak here, where we had a record high on the 16th of May, again during super bloom time, was around 36 parts per billion, record high for this site. So there was some evidence that a super bloom was going on here, but doesn't look like it was as intense as what was happening at Bucksport and Hagley. And this bloom persisted way into July. So remember that when Victoria is talking about her evidence for HAB species. Here's the time series from the Environmental Quality Lab chlorophyll at Highway 9, Reeves Ferry, Conway, Bucksport, and Hagley. There was a peak in here in the same time period from April to July. It was not as pronounced as what we saw, remember, at Bucksport and Hagley on the 20th of May, but there were certainly other high values that persisted again into July.
Susan, it looks like your screen is stuck, and we're still seeing that turbidity slide. I'm not seeing the chlorophyll slide.
How about now?
Nope. So I will share my screen.
Yeah, I'm going to stop my share. And could I just share again, or what do you want to do?
How about just use my screen?
Okay.
I think you only got 2 more slides.
Okay.
Were you talking this one or the next one?
Hang on a second. So this is a slide that showed that evidence for algal bloom upstream of Bucksport. This is 4 miles north of Conway, and it persisted through July. Next slide. There was also evidence of bloom persisting through July at the EQL monitoring sites. This is the chlorophyll data as well. Remember the 2 high values that we saw on the 20th. There were lesser elevated values at Bucksport and Hagley. Those are the red and the dark yellow sites, and to a lesser extent, some of the other upstream sites as well. Next slide. So in conclusion here, I think everybody should feel pretty impressed that we were able to use all of your data to make the case that something unusual happened on the river, certainly April through May and probably through July. We used all of your data to make the story, along with data collected by many other organizations. So collectively taking this approach provides much better coverage of water quality information over time and space. So we're leveraging everybody's data, which would guess makes the municipalities very happy, because all of this monitoring data is expensive. So we're trying to get the most bang for the buck out of these data. Algal blooms definitely are a concern on the Waccamaw. I think we've made that case. They represent a potential for causing low oxygen and fish kills after the organic matter created by the algae dies off and decomposes. The Waccamaw River is a place at great threat for low oxygen levels just because of the natural conditions of being a blackwater river with a lot of that colored organic matter, creating an oxygen deficit just naturally. As a consequence, the river has been listed since the 1990s for oxygen impairments, and that has caused DHEC to issue discharge limits to wastewater treatment plants so that the effluent that's discharged does not cause any further lowering of the oxygen levels. If we now are looking at issues with algae on the Waccamaw River that could also contribute to oxygen lowering, it's time to start looking at tracking these algal blooms. And that is what Victoria is going to talk about. I can also mention that DHEC has recognized this problem and is trying to develop water quality standards for nutrients and chlorophyll. So we're not just using our site normal levels that we've developed from our monitoring program, but also from a regulatory standpoint. So Victoria is going to talk more about this, and I will pass the floor over to her. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Susan. And don't worry, folks, you'll have a chance to talk to us and ask questions in just a moment. But I did want to point out that we weren't the only folks interested and concerned about harmful algal blooms this year. There was a pretty popular Facebook post that you're seeing now on your screen where you saw this very alarming photo. You don't have to know much about harmful algal blooms to see that this green coloration is very concerning. So we shared this information with DHEC and this group called the HABNet, the South Carolina Harmful Algal Bloom Network. We shared the photos and all the information we could, along with all of your data, so that they knew what was going on. And that green color, that very discolored water that you were seeing, was near Bucksport on the Waccamaw. So we shared that information with DHEC, and they went on a research cruise to try to find out, was this a source of harmful algal blooms? Was it a toxin producing species? What were the risks to our community? So DHEC went out there a couple days later, and even though it was just a couple days after that photo was taken, they did not find evidence of HABs, which this to me points out two things. One, how complicated HABs can be. Susan touched on this a little bit, but there's a variety of species that can produce toxins. Even if they are toxin producing, doesn't mean that they are necessarily producing toxins at that time. We aren't really sure the scale and scope of these harmful algal blooms. So that leads me to my next point, the need for continued monitoring. So what we're doing with your data and what you'll continue to do for 2022. So Working along with the HabNet and with DHEC, we hope to be part of this collaborative group to help identify and develop statewide resources for monitoring and investigating when these potential HAB blooms occurred. So your data might show us what a spot that we might want to do some follow-up sampling. We might want to have DHEC go out and do some more advanced sampling or to test for toxins. This past year, the Waccamaw Watershed Academy began learning more about phytoplankton and learned how to do the Phytoplankton Monitoring Network, NOAA's PMN program, where you're using a microscope and you're screening for a set group of harmful algal species. And if you identify this select group of harmful algal species, you would contact NOAA and they would contact the local authorities and that would prompt some sort of follow-up. We're happy to say we have not found any of these target species of concern so far, which is good news, but we'll continue to monitor in the future. And should either your data or our screening or any sort of other indicators suggest that we need to do further testing, we also can reach out to our partners and also researchers here and test for toxins and see if our communities are at risk. So right now we're working with our partners to sort of get more information about HABs on the Waccamaw. We'll see what happens this next year and identify hotspots, see if we get another super bloom, and we'll continue to be a big part of the DHEC's HAB network. So we're looking forward to that. I do want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I just wanted to say, if you'd like to contact us or learn more about HABs and more about your data, please contact us. And these are the folks who are who help support you in your volunteer monitoring program. And thank you. So now I think we're right on schedule to open it up for questions. If you don't know how to do that, on the bottom of your screen, you have the ability to type your questions into the chat or insert them in the Q&A section. We're probably not going to use the Q&A, the raise hand, sorry. We're not going to use the raise hand feature today, unless you're feeling really brave. But we prefer use the chat and Q&A.
We don't have any questions yet. I know that our volunteers have questions. They always have questions. If we had been in person, Susan never would have made it through her presentation without 20 hands up by this point. Even though we don't have 20 people, we would have had double hands up. But I suppose what we can do is to give you guys more time to think. We can either take the 10 minutes to hear a little bit about Sterrett Swamp, or we can introduce Dr. Martin and let her speak, and then come back and just do questions for everybody. Susan, are you available to stay on, or do you have to leave?
I have a class that starts at 3 p.m. I can stay till then.
Okay. All right. Well, seeing that we don't have any questions, Pam, are you here?
I'm happy to talk about Sterrett Swamp if you want.
I think I heard Pam.
Oh, Susan, hi, Susan, it's Pam. I'm not allowed to start my video unless I get permission, but there I go. Okay, there I go.
Hi, Pam.
There I am. Hey, hi, everybody. And I noticed some names on the participant list too, so it's nice to see everyone. Susan, I'd love to hear about Sterrett Swamp. So since Susan has to go at 3, I can certainly wait so that if people want to hear about that, she doesn't have to leave before. Up to you guys.
Sure, we can take a couple minutes.
Victoria, could you motor over to those slides?
Here we go. We got it. We're good.
Yeah, it's nice to talk about this because Chelsea brought it up. Chelsea, I'm going to call this a success story.
Oh, okay, great. I'm glad to hear you say it.
Yeah, sorry you sound frustrated.
No.
I guess when we look at the data, you'll see why I feel pretty upbeat about this. So we sample at Sterrett Swamp. Victoria, could you just show with your cursor where that sampling site is? Oh, that's teeny weeny. Okay, so it's that yellow push pin down there way on the left-hand side. And Sterrett Swamp drains all the way down to the Waccamaw River. So there's these broad floodplains that flow. Victoria, if you could just show the flow path of the swamp. Wow, that's, yeah. It flows right next to the landfill. Next click, please. Whoa, what happened there? That doesn't look healthy. Well, anyway, the volunteer monitoring site was set up at a location where DHEC had been sampling until 2016 or 2018, one of those two. And I think the reason that it was set up in Sterrett Swamp rather than in the river proper was to have a look at any potential impacts from the landfill. That little blue circle there is a borrow pit that is right in the floodplain of Sterrett Swamp. Okay, so this site has been 303D listed on the Federal Impaired Waters list since the start of the data collection for oxygen and fecal bacteria. Next slide. So we've been monitoring, this would be Team 2 has been monitoring at this site since 2007. And we noticed that the conductivity, the dissolved solids in the water, started getting very erratic in 2011. And it wasn't until we started meeting with Horry County about a turbidity issue here that we went back through the Google Earth time series of photos and noticed that that was the point at which the borrow pit circled in blue was constructed. So we sort of had circumstantial evidence for discharges from the borrow pit affecting the conductivity in a way I'd expect. Higher conductivity water, since the borrow pit is dug deep and it's picking up groundwater from the surrounding area. Next slide. So we noticed very high turbidities in 2021. Victoria, just put the cursor on those high turbidity levels, like smoking high. The state water quality criteria for turbidity is 50. And this is the point at which the provisional reports that we emailed to the municipalities started getting to be bold-faced and underlined. We have a problem here and it's not a one-time thing. Something persistent is happening. It doesn't seem to be tracking the same time period as the conductivity, but boy, there was something afoot. Please advance, Victoria. Okay, so I zoomed in here on the turbidity data to show that we or this would be Dale, started reporting very high levels during August, and it just stayed almost always very, very high. Next, click forward. Okay, so I'm happy to say that Chelsea and her colleagues did speak with folks at the landfill, implemented a bunch of sediment control practices that look like they have significantly lowered the turbidity. Victoria, could you just show the two last measurements? So Chelsea, you were out talking to those folks in early November, and by the end of November, look at that, we're down much lower than, we're below the water quality criteria. We're still above the median value for this site, but definitely tracking in the right direction. So this is one of these cases where the volunteer data alerted the municipalities to a problem, who were able to get a water quality improvement pretty quickly. I think that's it. I think that's the last slide. So that's an upbeat end to the water quality story. Pam, thanks for letting me get that in there. I think it's a good story.
I'll chime in real quick, and I'll just say, I think it's a good story too. I just think that sometimes, you know, especially from the collectors, the volunteers collecting the data, they might be very passionate about, you know, the water quality in that area in Sterrett Swamp. And I feel like I could see their point of view saying, like, it's still happening. It's still happening. When are we going to address the problem? And I felt like I was on your team. I was like, we need to do something. We need to get out there. So I am happy to see that there are some changes, and hopefully it will continue to be that way.
Well, thank you very much for working with us. Really appreciate getting a resolution to this.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both for talking about that. We do have a question in the chat that you might be able to answer. Has there been any movement towards implementing EPA's recommended turbidity standard from 2000? Any updates on that y'all know of?
All of these lack of water quality standard for turbidity, nutrients, and chlorophyll are all linked to trying to develop better regulatory tools for tracking algal blooms. And I'll say that the state has been trying to do this for decades. I'm not aware that, other than continuing to try, any progress has been made. And you can rest assured that at every opportunity, I ask the same question to DHEC directly. I think they're kind of under-resourced for undertaking something like this. You might recall that around 2008, when we had that big economic nosedive, there was budget cutting, serious budget cutting done at DHEC. And there's been some recovery there, but I've always thought in a paranoid fashion that that was a way to get less water quality information and hence take the pressure off on resolving some of these problems. So that is the consequence of under-resourcing. We don't have water quality standards.
That's a really good point, Susan. And we always encourage anyone, volunteers, community members, stay on top of these things, know what's going on at the state and the local level in terms of water quality, and get involved. That's the only way that changes are going to come about. And your data really helps with that. So Pam, thank you so much for allowing us to talk a little bit about Sterrett Swamp real quick, giving up a little bit of your time. But we would love to hear from you and hear your presentation. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Pamela Martin. And Pam, I will let you speak about all of your interesting qualifications and all the cool things that you do in our community.
Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. And can you see my screen too?
We can see it. It looks like it's still in the, not the full, there we go.
All good?
You
Excellent.
are good to go.
Okay. Well, Susan and Kara and Victoria, I finally see you for real. And I'm sorry we couldn't all be together, but it's really actually nice to see, especially Susan. I haven't seen you in a while on campus, so that was nice. And Sterrett Swamp, I think, and the entire conversation that I caught at the last maybe 20 minutes there, I think is a great dovetail to a lot of the work I've been doing on rights of nature research. So for those of you that I don't know, thanks so much. And my name is Pam Martin. I'm at Coastal Carolina University as well. And I am in the Department of Politics, but I am actually a distinguished honors fellow in the Honors College in our new Sustainability and Coastal Resilience major. I am also the executive director of our United Nations Regional Center of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development, which is a way long title, which is why we shortened it to Georgetown RISE, which stands for Resilience, Innovation, Sustainability, and Education. Funny enough, I came here from a South Carolina Office of Resilience meeting where we're trying to look at creating the resilience plan. And gosh, Susan, I'm going to recommend that your data be used on the environmental subcommittee from EQL. I always recommend it, but it's really, really important. So in the fall of 2021, so just a few months ago, I had a book come out with MIT. It's called The Politics of Rights of Nature, Strategies for Building a More Sustainable Future. My background is as an environmental policy analyst, but more at the global level. In fact, I really just started dipping my toe into things in South Carolina in 2015. Most of my work has been at Coastal on the international side of looking at indigenous communities in the Amazon and communities in the Galapagos Islands and other places in South America. And sustainable development, particularly in the area of extraction. But after some deep reflection on the fact that I've lived here since 1998 and both of my children are born here, my family, we live here, I really wanted to create a link to the local community. And that's how I started the UN Center. But when I started researching rights of nature laws, which I'll explain in a minute, I started to immediately see, especially with the conversation that you all just had, the direct correlation between rights of nature movements and laws and some of the work that important people like Susan and Victoria, Kara, and others are doing in South Carolina. So Georgetown RISE is also, I see Jen's on the call. We partner with the National Estuarine Research Reserve at North Inlet, Wanya Bay. And we, as I said, we are part of the United Nations University program through the UN that runs through the UN University in Tokyo. We are actually the only regional center of expertise for sustainable development along the Southeast coast. And we are one of just a handful in the United States, actually. But what is rights of nature? So if you are involved at all with the river keepers, you may know that the river keepers are, in fact, very engaged with rights of nature, particularly out west. I'm going to talk about some of the activities that Gary Wachner is doing out in Colorado. But it's a philosophy that is called earth jurisprudence or earth law. And it really is essentially taking our knowledge of ecosystems and providing ecosystems as subjects within the law. Actually, there are more than 180 rights of nature laws. Just last night, I didn't change this in the slide because I was in meetings this morning, but It's now, rights of nature laws are in over 35 countries, and they are verging on over 230 rights of nature laws across those 5 continents. So, and that includes, in fact, one of the pioneering countries on rights of nature laws is the United States, which I will talk about. So the book goes into what is Earth law, rights of nature, and what are some important cases. It's really written in a less of an academic format, more of a format to inform and help people who are interested in this. And a lot of the data that all of you are collecting is very important in forming these laws. So as I mentioned, it's this emerging body of law, and it's about protecting nature, but also restoring it and stabilizing it and recognizing our human interdependence on Earth's life cycle and our actual life support systems. And what you may say, well, we have law. What makes Earth law so different? Well, in fact, Western law, especially during times of enlightenment, if we think about the Enlightenment, it was a lot about being separate from nature, dominating nature, individuals, rather looking at nature as individual stocks of resources, property. If you think of Locke and Hobbes and all of the Adam Smith, if you think about the time period from the Renaissance all the way through the Enlightenment, including in the founding of the United States, a lot of the thought that framed our Western legal systems was not rather grounded in nature as a life-giving force, but rather grounded in exploitation of nature, which we later called development. And our economic system was framed on exponential growth, essentially legalizing some of the harms like Sterrett swamp, but many of the harms that many of you are seeing in some of your data collection, those harms are caused by a system that was based on Western law that didn't have a knowledge that we have today of Earth law. So Earth law, humans as a part of nature, that we are nested within our living ecosystems and vitally interconnected to them. We have reciprocal relationships to them. And we can talk a lot about this. This doesn't come without controversy, obviously. But the idea of Earth law or these rights of nature laws that give nature a subject in the legal framework, talk about providing an equilibrium rather, or a healthy ecosystem, living in harmony with nature to prevent these extreme environmental harms. And so the difference of Earth law is that its foundation, rather than the foundation being private property or extractive materials or exponential economic growth, not that economic growth is not part of Earth law, but rather all of that growth is dependent upon understanding our interconnectedness to our ecosystems, i.e. the fact that we have to have clean water to survive. And really the rights of nature, one of the things that you will see in rights of nature laws is that nature is given the right to exist in the laws, to thrive, to evolve, and to be restored. And so how is this different? A person has rights under the law currently, but many times property does not have rights. And so currently humans and corporations, governments, even ships have rights, but not that animals have no rights. There are cases in which animals and ecosystems have rights, but they're not given the rights as subjects to defend themselves in many of our legal systems. And so this is really about correcting the flaws in our legal system. And I want to talk to you a little bit about, just give you one of the foremost thinkers on Earth jurisprudence and rights of nature law is Cormac Cullinan. He's in South Africa, but he talks about the fundamental and inherent right of all beings, not just humans, right? So taking that more ecosystem approach and that no one needs to have those rights granted to them. Rather, just like the Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt penned after the Second World War, we need a language that speaks to rights of all. So a declaration of rights of all living things. And there is a harmony. If you're wondering, is this something that, you know, is organized globally? There is. I'm part of the expert platform, but there is a United Nations Harmony with Nature program. And how does this relate to our work in sustainable development? That's a term that a lot of us have been using, have been working around, resilience and sustainable development. The way we traditionally think of sustainable development are these interlocking circles. And if you're sustainable, you find this balance among them. People, planet, and prosperity is the current terms, but some of you may know it as social, economic, and environmental. That term was coined in 1987. And well, we haven't come very far on our planet since 1987, even though we have these small strides like Sterrett Swamp. So the rights of nature model, as you can see on the right-hand side, moves from that 3 interlinking circles to incorporating to recognizing that we have biospheric limits, that people should be, and all living things need to be nested within those limits, and that our economy should serve our ability to survive and thrive. And when we think about what we're looking at right now in South Carolina in terms of resilience planning is about anticipating. This is from the state, not from me, but it's pretty common. Anticipating, adapting, surviving, and then thriving. And so when we look at rights of nature model, it's this ability to create laws or policies or regulations that recognize first the limits that Mother Nature places on us, but also the opportunities and the benefits that she gives us. And this relates directly to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is what the UN center that I work on at Coastal with the NEAR as well, and others in Georgetown County, recognizes these 17 goals. But if you look at them here, you see they're not interlinked. So that climate change, life on land, sort of the green goals or the environmental goals are on the bottom. But here's an approach that Earth Law here's how Earth Law would look at sustainable development. Looking first at your planetary boundaries and looking at your natural resources, so your water, obviously, your land, your forests, etc. How clean is your water? How protected is it? And then looking at how people fit within that natural system and how the economy, and you see how the economy goes both ways, that we gain from the economy, but also the economy gains from nature. And that's sort of the bridging of how we get from Agenda 2030, which is the UN declaration that all 193 states in the United Nations have signed on to, how we get from these global goals right down to Georgetown and Horry counties. And essentially it's codified in a document that the US has also agreed to, but all the other countries in the UN as well. Earth and its ecosystems are our home. Mother Earth is a common expression, right, for recognizing that and promoting sustainable development. So I'd like to skip over these slides and get to a couple of the stories in the book, because the book is really stories. And one of the stories, this is a picture of Casey Camp Hornick, and she is one of the elders of the Ponca Nation in Oklahoma. And I met Casey in the United States, but I've traveled with her to Ecuador, and her indigenous group is looking at their rights of water because oil refineries that you can see her standing in front of in this picture, they're finding intrusion from refining properties and hydraulic fracturing in their water systems. And so the Ponca were actually one of the first tribes in the United States to, within their own tribal law, give nature a right to exist and thrive. And many indigenous groups in the United States, as you'll see, are linking with indigenous communities around the world, because a lot of the thought process on earth jurisprudence comes from indigenous traditional knowledge of linking humans with the natural world, that they're one and the same. So there's also a global alliance for rights of nature. In fact, I'm on the steering committee for the academic hub, but you should know that there are communities from the United States, like I mentioned, the River Keepers and communities all over the world that are organizing to help pass laws that recognize ecosystem rights and protect ecosystems. This is a conference I was at in Quito, and really the important thing to look at here is there are people from all over the world that came to celebrate. Ecuador was the first constitution to have rights of nature codified in its national constitution in 2008. And there we have indigenous peoples from all over the world celebrating the 10-year, at the time it was 2018. So back in the pre-COVID days, when you could travel and be in a picture without a mask on. And so there's a celebration of a country that for 10 years, well, now over 10 years, has had rights of nature codified in its national constitution. And so I mentioned Ecuador, but it has 3 articles that give nature ecosystem rights to be protected and to be restored. But actually, Ecuador was not the first place to pass rights of nature laws. It was in a small borough of Tamaqua, Pennsylvania in 2006, and that's Kathy Murelli. Kathy was a school nurse. In fact, this entire talk is really based on water quality and the importance of water in our communities. Kathy, as a school nurse, started to recognize that her students were getting sick, and she used to attend her borough council meetings. And she understood that there was going to be a sledge dumping facility, and it was less than a mile, almost right next to the school that she worked in. Kathy went to her borough council. They had training from a group that's called Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund that gives these types of trainings. And eventually she convinced her borough to give water rights and to make illegal any type of industry that would have the potential to pollute their water supply. I should note that in many rural places, not unlike our own, as I mentioned, I just came from a meeting where someone was talking about well water. Well, many people in South Carolina have well water, which of course, groundwater and well water. Susan was mentioning groundwater impacts. Well, Kathy and many of her neighbors in Tamaqua have well water. And so they were vitally concerned. This is the first place in the world to have given in a local ordinance, so a local legal ordinance to not allow sledge dumping and wastewater dumping in their community, and it was never opposed. That's not the case moving forward, but Kathy unfortunately lost 2 of her family members to cancer. She went on to do her master's in nursing to look at epidemiological studies and impacts of toxins in the body. And she found that there was a high level of toxins in her community, and it was a specific type of leukemia that was impacting her community. And so moving along, there's another case and a story, and I hope you recognize yourself. I certainly did. Well, no, these people are far braver and more courageous than I am, but they're regular people. There we have 3 members, 2 members of the Board of Supervisors in Grant Township in Pennsylvania, another small rural farming community. The gentleman in the front has an Airbnb. And the woman behind the woman in the middle is the woman in the middle's daughter. She's a graphic designer, but they happen to sit on the Board of Supervisors. And when a hydraulic fracturing company wanted to put its wastewater injection wells in the old wells that were there from oil extraction many years ago in Grant Township, they opposed it. Long story short, Grant Township is right now probably the rock star. There's Invisible Hand. There's a movie about this community, but they are the rock star community for opposing a large industry, an energy company, as I mentioned, that wanted to put wastewater injection wells. They opposed it. They were sued. It turns out not only were they sued by the company, but they were also sued by their own Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania. And that was a turn of events they had not anticipated, because unlike South Carolina, Pennsylvania has a preemptive law, which is an oil and gas law that allows for subsoil rights. So it preempts any type of local laws. However, as it also turns out, as the plot thickens, and you can read more about this in the book, Pennsylvania also is a state that has the right to a healthy environment, that gives the right to a healthy environment to its citizens. And so now the Department of the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania has removed its suit against the community, but the community is pressing forward because it wants to see, it's still in the court system, whether communities, small, local, municipal communities, have the right to protect their own natural resources against industry because they have the constitutional right in their state for a healthy environment. It's a path-breaking case, and we're excited to see what the outcome is. But I just wanted to point out that rights of nature story. And that's a case where the Little Mahoning watershed is the ecosystem that they're saying has a right to thrive, to be restored, and to be protected. And just like Grant Township, you see these people. In fact, both of these communities are more conservative communities. A lot of times when I give this presentation, sometimes people will ask, well, this seems like a very liberal democratic type of idea. And in fact, the communities that have been the most forthright are small, conservative, rural communities. It's the exact opposite of what some people might expect. And this community in Highland Township wanted to protect its ecosystem, or its Crystal Springs. A similar situation, except for the fact that its Board of Supervisors was not as united on this issue. And in fact, they were threatened by a lawsuit by large industry, their wastewater hydraulic fracturing company that wanted to inject wastewater injection in their community. This was a case that was not as successful as Grant Township, although they are still opposing it. But it looks like there has been given the green light for wastewater injection. But if Grant Township's case wins, that may be overturned. But I just wanted to point out an example of two communities that are in actually different parts of rural Pennsylvania, but communities of regular people that are looking at how can they protect themselves, how can they protect their water supply, et cetera. So a big case, though, that has been in the news, and this is the case that's on the cover of the book. My co-author, Craig, traveled to New Zealand. He and I, the book covers cases from various continents, and well, we both have kids and families and jobs, and so we split the difference. And I went to South America, and he went to New Zealand. I'm a little jealous of that, but that was the deal. And so in 2012, the Wanganui River in New Zealand, they gave the Wanganui River actual rights, and this created a different system. In Ecuador in the United States, the law protected an ecosystem. In Ecuador, it's all of the ecosystem of the country. In the United States, because of our federal structure, these laws are very dependent upon where you live and your legal and political structures. But in the United States, local laws have been passed in this way. In New Zealand, though, the Maori had the opportunity to renegotiate with the Crown, their former colony, and they decided that the best way to reflect their vision of the Wanganui River was to create a guardianship council, because in their mind, nature doesn't have rights. We as humans have a duty and an obligation, a responsibility to be one with nature, to protect nature. In fact, their lineage comes from the Wanganui River in their way, in their indigenous cosmovision. And so that was the first country to give a river actual rights. And in this case, from New Zealand, then Colombia further gave rights of nature on the Atrato River, which I will talk about. But the interesting part of the Wanganui River is that it created a guardianship council. This is something, we have water management organizations in the United States. Something I think that Susan said is very important. There's a legal scholar who writes on water law. Her name is Erin O'Donnell. And she talks about unfunded mandates. And so no matter how many regulations DHEC or any government body has, if there's no one implementing and enforcing them, if there's not funding placed toward it, it's simply an unfunded mandate. In the case of the Te Awa Tapua and the Wanganui River, there is a guardianship model and it is representative. And so far they are working, they're just right now creating their advisory group, but it is a diverse and equitable advisory group that includes the Maori, the Crown government, et cetera. And so this guardianship model, I think, has a lot of implications I'll talk about for our area in South Carolina. I want to also point out that New Zealand has given a national park, so a forest rights, and created, I think, an interesting structure in which the local people who live in that park are part of the board that establishes the principles for the park and the management for the park. So rather than having principles come down from people that don't live there or maybe don't interact with that area, local people are engaged in the management of the forest. And you know, rivers mean a lot to us. I happen to live on the Waccamaw River, but rivers mean a lot to us in South Carolina and all over the world, linking us to each other, to our natural world. And obviously, when I think about the Waccamaw, it also links me to my drinking water. And so I think rivers are a great way to think about the importance of nature and actually codifying that in some way. I had the pleasure of meeting Judge Palacio in 2018, and he was the first judge to recognize the rights of one of Colombia's largest rivers, the Atrato River. And I think it's important to point out this is an Afro-Colombian and indigenous region, the Chocó. And what's important about this is that the level of poverty and extreme poverty in this area is immense. The mercury levels, if you look at the mercury levels on our DHEC website in our own river system, you'll notice that they are high. They're often all red rivers for fish consumption advisories. And the Judge Palacio, he went to the Chocó region and he recognized that it was unacceptable. This happened to be from illegal gold mining along the river. But it was impacting, these mercury levels were impacting child death and illnesses, pollution, and this is an agricultural fishing community. And so it was impacting their food sources. This is not unlike many people along the river systems in South Carolina. And as you may relate to, the people in the Chocó region, they actually organize and they went to different government bodies, as you can see listed here. I won't read them to you, but they would go to the mining agency and the mining agency would say, no, you have to go to this other working group. And then they would go to the health agency and the health agency would say, no, you have to go to the environmental group. Long and short, they worked themselves through the court system. And the judge actually said, we signed on to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but none of our ministries, neither environment nor housing nor defense, neither the local government is enacting any form of sustainable development because our governance system itself is not interlinked. And so he mandated a structure, a guardianship council that also, so a group of 14 guardians in the Chocó region that's representative, but also non-governmental organization actors, as well as scientists from the university that assisted in the lawsuit to create toxicology and epidemiology studies. But also he mandated that the ministries themselves communicate with one another and sit on the guardianship council and listen to the local people. And so there's essentially a breakdown of the council. I want to talk about a place in Ecuador that has a beautiful park, the Cajas National Park, a freshwater high altitude park, and that's Cuenca on the right-hand side. It's a city that's surrounded by that park. Its water system comes from that park and it's been threatened by mining. In fact, there's mining to the south of it. And so this local community, led by its governor, Yacu Perez, Yacu means water in Quechua. They went to the Supreme because in Ecuador, there is a Supreme, a constitutional article that gives nature rights. And so they wanted to test it to see, could a local community, a local, in their case, province, similar to a county in our case, or actually similar to a state in our case, but could a state or a province actually say that they did not want mining because they wanted to protect their water system? Long and short, this is what happens when you have a constitutional article. The referendum passed, and now Cuenca, the city, this is actually municipal government, but Cuenca, the municipal government, can say whether or not it wants mining in its municipal area. And I think that's an interesting example for some of us. There's been multiple cases of threats to water along the Black River, along the Waccamaw because of mining in our area. It's an interesting case example that we can learn from. Can municipalities say we don't want mining, we don't want industries or activities that threaten our water system, our water supply? Here's an example of a river keeper in the Colorado. And in fact, there are 3 cases right now in Colorado. I'll just show you this one. But this is a municipal case in Boulder, Colorado, looking to pass an ordinance, so a local municipal law that creates a guardianship council to defend the rights of the Boulder Creek and its watershed. And it talks about considering public input and making recommendations, compiling best practices. The guardianship council would release transparent reports, have public engagement, public meetings, working with the city on this initiative. Long story short, this is a great example within the US of how a rights of nature or more earth jurisprudential approach could take place in a municipal type of setting. Speaking of algal blooms, really was really happy to hear that you're working on that. Really sad to hear of Bucksport as a community with whom I've been working, that there was some evidence of that show up last year. But Florida obviously struggles tremendously with this issue. Orange County, Chuck O'Neill is the leader of the Rights of Nature in Florida movement. They actually passed a ballot initiative at the county level for the right to clean water. The problem with this, as we'll see in the United States, many states, and you might think back to the plastic bag ban that you may have been involved with in our area, but many states create state laws that preempt these local ballot initiatives or home rule charter initiatives. And in the case of Florida, this is being challenged, but the Florida Rights of Nature group is now proposing a constitutional amendment for the right to clean water. And we could get into details on this, but attorneys are working hard to craft legislation at state levels that will not be will not be countered by lawsuits, which is difficult, especially from industry in the United States, but in many places in the world. And this is an example. I'll just skip to say that the Chippewa, in fact, are an indigenous tribe out west, and they're of the Anishinaabe culture, and they want to protect their wetland ecosystems because Manuman, their rice, grows in those systems, in those wetland ecosystems, and there are oil pipelines that are threatening the security and the cleanliness of their water system. So you may say, gosh, that's a lot of stuff there, Pam. How in the world could we do this in South Carolina? Well, you can have an ordinance. It could be a zoning ordinance. You could have, in Santa Monica, they were very proactive. In Santa Monica, they passed a sustainability ordinance that mandates clean water and gives certain guidelines, et cetera. And they report out on it every year. If we have tribal communities, which we do have indigenous communities in our area, indigenous statutes have been very effective, or indigenous constitutional amendments, tribal amendments. A lot of times, the Magpie River in Quebec is actually an interesting one, because that is an example of giving not just personhood, but the rights to non-person rights to the Magpie River in Quebec. and they're working on the Lawrence River, the Rights of Nature group in Canada. And this is a partnership with the Indigenous Council and the municipality in outside of Quebec to create this joint legislation to protect the Magpie River. But when we think about our local area, I think about our wetland loss at 70%. And I think about South Carolina's stressors for wetlands, and you can see them there: removal, ditching, etc. And the value of wetlands that sequester carbon, that improve our climates, protect against storms, mitigate flooding, regulate flow, etc. And I think about how much those ecosystem services actually provide. Some estimates say up to $67 billion a year for us. And those are some of my kids on the left-hand side, but you think about our quality of life, our heritage, and our culture. It's not so unfamiliar from some of the stories I just talked to you about, the cultural linkages to many of the water systems, but the economic linkages are there for us as well. We have cultural linkages through our Gullah culture and through our indigenous cultures, and through our tourism. $20 billion a year. I've heard estimates up to $30 billion a year in South Carolina, 1 in 10 jobs, and look at the amount of billions in state revenue. And so our water is a way of life for us in our area in South Carolina along the Grand Strand. And so I think there are ways, given the data that you all are providing, that we could justify certainly looking at earth law, depending, some people call it earth law, earth jurisprudence. There are some exciting things that are happening around the globe, including now, because there is a constitutional amendment in Ecuador, there is a question as to whether a state can give an environmental impact assessment and license an activity when they know that that activity will damage nature. And these are all pending in their equivalent of the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador. Okay, so I'm very open to questions and conversation on this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone.
Thank you, Pam. That was great and really inspiring to see that there are places, not just, across the world giving rights to nature, but even here in our own country. So I think that's really exciting. And I hope that one day we'll be able to get that Guardian Council going on the Waccamaw. That would be amazing.
Well, Kara, let me give you an example of Blue Mountain, Australia. It's one that I didn't put in there, but it's a really easy one. I should say that my book is available for free. In fact, if you I'll put the link in the chat. It's online for free. Thank you, Deborah. If you'd like to purchase it, of course, I'm happy for that too. But it was really important to Craig and to me that we make it available to anyone who wants a copy of it for free as well, if you like reading digitally. But I should say that in Blue Mountain, Australia, so when I started this work in 2008 or so, I thought there would be no cases. And when I called a friend in Australia who works on this, she said, no way, we're so far behind. Well, as it turns out, in Blue Mountain, Australia, they didn't go to the extent to pass a law, to legislate, do all those things that seem overwhelming to most of us, at least to me. Their planning commission just decided that they were going to, in all of their planning decisions, engage an earth jurisprudence approach. And so they just made it a policy on which nobody had to democratically vote. They voted their planning commissioners in. We're thinking about comprehensive planning, resilience plans right now in our communities. And that's a really easy way for people to start saying, well, should we be basing our planning on like EQL data? Should we be basing our planning on our water?
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like there are a lot of different approaches to getting it enacted and making it happen. And there was a question of how are these new ordinances enforced and not just ignored?
Yeah, and that is I think I saw that from Susan, and that is an excellent question. I'm just looking for I was looking for the free copy of my book so I could stick it in here it is. Let me just put this in there and then I'll answer your questions so that I don't forget.
We'll be sure to share that as well with all the registrants.
Yeah, please feel free. Let me look for our chat button here and I'll stick it in there. So Susan,
Pam's
great
looking
question.
at your sorry, Pam, while she's
No,
looking,
go ahead
and throw your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We still have a couple minutes, so all right, I'll let you talk.
Oh no, I was just going to say, so I in Ecuador, for example, I didn't think they were going to be enforced. When I started this, my friend Craig and I that write together, I laughed and said, we're not going to find one case after this constitutional amendment. How they are enforced is when you have a law, it's getting the law passed. If you have a law, especially a constitutional law, in Ecuador, it's regular judges at the municipal level. We're just looking at the Constitution and saying, this infringes nature. It hurts nature. You can't build a road here and then silt up the entire river and close its flow. It has to be restored. And they restored it it's called the Vilcabamba River. That was the first case there. So it was very simple cases. That's in Ecuador. Now, how they're being enforced in the United States is a different thing. So in Pennsylvania, I told you about the fight at the local level to oppose industry. And it's being enforced by home rule charter and laws that they're trying to uphold because they have a state constitution. In Florida, their local law is being challenged and they think it's going to lose. And so they're going for a state constitutional amendment. In the United States, that's what people are finding, that state constitutional amendments are the strongest form. I mean, outside of having a constitutional amendment. On the guardianship council side, we don't know yet because I have interviewed people in Colombia and it's again the same thing. If you could have a water management organization all day long, but if nobody does, which we've had a Winya watershed group. If nobody does anything and nothing is enforced, it's again an unfunded mandate. So how enforcement mechanisms in informal governance structures, right, that aren't structures that are mandated to report to DHEC. They have to be funded, and then there has to be a voice in the government that is representing them. So if it's at a local level, to county council or to a planning commission. So yeah, the thing is right now, our laws, as you point out, allow for levels of things that we don't want in our water.
That's right. Okay. Thanks, Pam. Sorry, I was looking to see if there were any more questions. I do not see any at the moment. Keep in mind, everybody, if you have questions and you don't want to ask them now or they come to you later, please feel free to contact me or Victoria, and we will get those answers for you. Oh, great question. Christine asks, what do you propose for the first step locally?
Okay, so I've thought a lot about it, as you know, and I think that there are some things that can be done, like inserting these types of thought processes into our zoning ordinances. Could be, you can start small. It can be looking at stormwater runoff, for example, and in starting to, in a small way, insert these types of thinking. Okay, looks like our EQL data is showing that the Morse Landing at Morse Park and Merle's Inlet has E. coli data that's off the charts. Well, we need to respond to that, and creating zoning that doesn't allow for this type of runoff. That's simple. But if you wanted to get something like a county ordinance, you'd first start with a resolution, and would be getting people like all of you here together to provide the data to say, and I realize I live optimistically, but I think most of us agree that water is important. We can't live without it. And most of us live here because we love water and all that it brings the quality of our life. I don't think it would be a hard stretch to be able to protect water in a resolution. Once you have a resolution which is not legally binding, you can then build a culture. Resolutions are easy to pass, right? We love water, let's pass a water thing. Nobody cares because it's not legally binding, but it does create some type of norm that starts the ball rolling.
That's a really great point, Pam. I agree 100%. I don't think anybody on this webinar today would argue that water is not important. But surprisingly, there are a lot of people who you kind of have to force that belief upon, but we do our best. So I guess my encouragement for all of the attendees today is to do your part. Be clean water stewards. I know that a lot of you are already doing your part by being volunteers for the water quality monitoring program, but we need your voices as well. So if you're not telling people how important the water is and how important water quality is, it's time to start doing it, because otherwise we're not going to have clean water to protect in the first place, and your monitoring will be a lot less fun. Okay, so we are just out of time. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to our amazing speakers, Pam and Victoria and Susan, who unfortunately had to leave to go to class, teaching, not attending, I'd hope. And also to Chelsea for joining us today. We are grateful for everything that everyone on this webinar does in their personal and professional lives, and we could not do it without you. So thank you to every one of you. Victoria, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, please. If this was not enough for you, if you need more clean water events, if your thirst has not been quenched, literally and figuratively, please join us for some upcoming events that we're hosting. The Waccamaw Riverkeeper will be hosting Green Drinks. It is our program's 21st birthday. So what better way to celebrate than to come out and have a beer with your Riverkeeper, and for every beer purchased at Tidal Creek Brewery that evening during our event, $1 will be donated to Winyah Rivers Alliance and will help protect clean water in your watershed. So for every beer you drink, you'll be doing your part. And so we invite you to come out to that. And then stay tuned. The 2022 Waccamaw Conference is going to focus on the Clean Water Act at 50. So this year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. For 50 years, the act has been protecting our right to clean water, and we've come a long way, but we still have some work to do. So I hope you'll join us during that week. We're going to have in-person events and also webinars and things like that. And we'll be doing a 50 actions challenge. So let's see how many of our 50 actions to protect clean water you can do starting January 29th through March 26th. So make sure you're following us online. Come out and join us at those things. And if you want to get in touch with us, our information is here. You can contact me or Victoria. And if you're not already, make sure that you are following Winyah Rivers and the Waccamaw Watershed Academy on Facebook. That's a great way to stay up to date with what we're doing. Things like this, other webinars, and fun events in the future. So we hope we will see you, and we hope that you all keep protecting clean water. And we thank you for joining us today. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.